Philosophy is not just about old books and timeless, eternal questions. At its best, philosophy is highly relevant and practical to your everyday life. And today we're going to illustrate just that point using real-life moral dilemmas from the Reddit forum, Am I the Arsehole? So let's get started. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, this post reads, Am I the arsehole for honouring my deceased brother's wishes and not letting his estranged wife attend his funeral? Throwaway because she knows my standard username. My brother recently passed away due to kidney failure. He has been dealing with kidney problems most of his adult life. About 6 months ago, his wife of 5 years said she wanted a divorce. She wasn't happy, she thinks she deserves to be happy, and with someone exciting. My brother was a good earner and worked long hours. She was a stay-at-home wife. After his most recent bout of kidney issues while in hospital, he made out his will, made sure she got sweet F all, she was already seeing someone else, and he specified that he does not want her at his funeral. He passed about a month ago, and at his request, she was not allowed at the funeral. She did try, though, and was not allowed in. She has since called me heartless and had a number of her family gang up on me and sending me messages, etc. She was even angrier that he left her nothing and had transferred his savings to me for my daughter's education. We haven't stopped her from visiting his grave, not like we can anyway, but as per his wishes, she was not allowed at the service. So, am I the arsehole? So obviously this post is just very sad. Losing a family member is absolutely tragic. And most people in the comments agree that this wasn't an inappropriate thing to do, to not let his estranged/ex-wife be at his funeral as per his request. The reasoning, however, I think is really, really interesting because it illustrates something about still the way that we do moral reasoning that, on the face of it, is a little bit peculiar within a secular context. So if you go to the comments under this post, pretty much all of them agree that he didn't do anything wrong, and the justification they give is specifically, you followed your brother's wishes. So, here's one that says you followed your brother's wishes. There's another one that says you did what your brother requested. And I know, on the face of it, right, we don't tend to appeal to people who no longer exist, which is how dead people are perceived in a secular context, right? Unless you are very religious and think that there is a persisting consciousness post-death, then on the face of it, it is a little bit strange to take into account when doing our moral reasoning the wishes of people who are no longer there. If you're something like a utilitarian, for example, this reasoning becomes incredibly strange at all. It is, in fact, a distortion of moral reasoning. Now, most people don't think this is a distortion of moral reasoning. They think it is appropriate to take into account the wishes of deceased people when we're talking about their belongings or their funeral desires in this case, right? And I think it is worth asking why that is. This post actually really kind of got me thinking about this topic because, again, I thought, well, I share this kind of intuition and I'm not religious. I don't believe in an afterlife. So what exactly is underpinning this? Where does this come from? Is it just, a kind of hangover from a bygone era? Or is there something kind of substantive in this? Can this be justified under a non-religious context? Anyway, I came across this paper by J. Jeremy Wisniewski called What We Owe the Dead, which attempts to make a kind of secular argument for obligations towards the dead, like the one outlined in this Reddit post. And he essentially says that we can think of our obligations towards the dead as analogous to our relationship of promise, right? If I promise someone something before they die, and then I do not carry out that promise, provided that promise is reasonable, then I have harmed them in some way, even if that harm is not something that they can feel. I mean, we can appeal to other intuitions to kind of try and justify this. Like we can think about how you might feel if somebody slandered you after your death, for example. We tend to care a fair amount about our posthumous reputation, which, again, on the face of it, is a little bit odd. We won't be around to experience it, so, who cares? But we do, nonetheless, care. There is something we do care about posthumous facts regarding ourselves. I mean, some of us don't, but at least that appears to be something that's still floating around the general populace. The counter-argument to such intuitions is, of course, the Epicurean one, which is where death is, I am not. Which is effectively saying that, okay, well, when you die, you cease to exist, so you are no longer capable of undergoing benefits or harms. It just doesn't make sense. Who is that harm or benefit happening to if you're no longer there? And anyway, it's a very, very interesting paper. And yes, it analyzes our obligations towards the deceased as something like fulfilling a promise. So provided that the promise was not immoral or unreasonable, yes, this author argues that we do have an obligation to carry out the deceased's wishes, which then tracks the reasoning in the Reddit post. Of course, you could argue, or you could ask, what exactly is underpinning that? Not in like a meta-ethical sense of why is anything right or wrong or something like that, but merely in the ethical sense of like, why is it that we still have an obligation to fulfill our promises when the person we have promised to no longer exists? And I suppose you could approach that in a number of ways. You could either say something like, well, if I care about certain posthumous events, then it is kind of part of the general game of caring about posthumous events for us to, oblige others' wishes upon their death so that when we die, our own wishes will also be taken into account. That's one way we could think about this as kind of a general chugging along, keeping society running. And then you might also have an argument for the utilitarian there, because you could say something like, well, everyone is just broadly happier knowing that their posthumous wishes are going to be carried out so long as they're reasonable. But of course, that reasonability criterion is important. So here's an example, and it's actually from another Reddit post, though not one we'll look at today. Imagine that there is a guy who owns a lot of land, say, and this guy has like deeply sexist attitudes such that he doesn't think that it is right to leave large amounts of property to women. And so when he writes his own will, he purposefully leaves out his daughters in the will. He just kind of, gives them knickknacks or whatever and leaves almost his entire estate to his only son. I think, we actually have systems in place, at least in the UK, to challenge such wills, because I think that we do place limits on the extent to which a dead person can have their posthumous wishes carried out, which is really interesting, right? This is a kind of clash between two values that we tend to hold, as that become even more complicated when the person involved is no longer with us. One is that somebody can broadly do whatever they want with their property, right? So if that person was still alive, then we wouldn't have any issue necessarily. Well, we wouldn't prevent him from merely just giving all of his property to his son and not to his daughters. We tend to think, okay, it's yours. You can do basically whatever you want with it as long as you're not kind of, stepping on or infringing the rights of others. Okay, that's like a general principle that we often have. However, when it comes to post-death wishes, there are legal frameworks within which we can interfere with that will and instead say that, no, this is not fair. This is an insufficiently justified posthumous wish, and so we're going to intervene and split things up more evenly. Again, it's very interesting, right? That would indicate that though we respect the wishes of people once they're gone, we don't respect them as much as when they're here. That's something that, on its face, can be a little bit weird. Why is it that we respect the wishes less when the person has deceased, if we've already said that we're going to respect people's wishes about what we do with them and their property after their death? But the kind of promises model allows us to make a bit more sense of this, right? Because we normally say that if you promise something to someone, and that thing that they ask you to do is revealed to be immoral, you no longer have an obligation to carry out that promise. So say we were talking and you were like, Joe, I need you to promise me something. It's a really big deal. Can you promise to do whatever I say in my next sentence? And I say, yeah, of course, like whatever, man. And you then say, I need you to go like rob a shop for me. Well, we tend to think that even though I have said, I promise to do whatever you ask me to do in your next sentence, and that would entail me promising to go and rob a shop, we tend to think, no, you don't have an obligation to carry out those wishes because they violate some kind of broader moral principle. So again, I think even though that's not what this promising model is aimed at in this paper, it's just aimed at establishing why we have certain obligations towards the dead, I think that it also helps clarify why it is that somebody can do whatever they want with their property while they're alive, or we tend not to judge them as harshly, but that we allow for people to challenge inheritances on the grounds that they might be unfair or discriminatory. It's that we may not be obliged to carry out an immoral or unreasonable promise, and a will is a form of kind of imposed promise on the executor of the estate or something like that. I find these discussions really, really interesting about what we owe the dead in a specifically secular context where the dead are not posited to like actually exist or still exist in a perfectly real, if non-physical sense. Because one thing that a great many political philosophers have sometimes argued is that we should conceive of a society as itself, kind of on a macro scale, having obligations towards ex-members of the society, i.e. those who are dead, and future members of the society who are not born yet. And people often seem quite happy to acquiesce to the idea that we have obligations to future members of the society that don't exist yet. Our duties towards the unborn. If this current generation that I'm a part of, for example, were to, I don't know, blow up the world for shits and giggles, then we would tend to think that not only have we done harm to the existing people, we have done harm to future people by depriving them of the ability to access a good world, or a world that is as good as it could be. However, people are much, I think, less comfortable with broad societal obligations towards the dead as a class. But we are much more comfortable with kind of micro-scale obligations towards those who've recently passed on. So I don't know. I think it's very, very interesting. I mean, one of the issues that I forgot his name now, but this guy brings up in this paper is that we're very comfortable with people, archaeologists, for example, essentially just like digging up consecrated dead bodies for educational purposes in a way that we would deem deeply uncomfortable if it were someone who has recently passed. And I know there are various different moral angles here. I've kind of gone on a bit of a ramble there, but my point is that actually within a non-theistic context, our obligations towards the dead and how we treat the dead and how we treat the dead's wishes are just like a non-trivial and fascinating philosophical problem that I think we could give a bit more thought to, because most people do feel very strongly about how we treat the dead. I mean, respect for the dead, right? We have Remembrance Sunday in the UK in November, where you kind of have basically a universal national mourning for kind of soldiers that have died during World War I and World War II and also subsequently. And like that, if somebody were to behave disrespectfully in that time period, they would be socially chastised for it. That's an example of kind of broad respect for dead. I don't know. I've kind of become really fascinated on this topic. I might do a whole video on it because I think that it is. Again, it's one of those areas where you'd think that respect for dead in a secular context would be quite difficult to justify, but actually it's just like this incredibly thorny issue, and some parts are easy to justify and some parts hard to justify. And I don't know, it's all very complicated and just an absolutely delicious philosophical problem. So anyway, moving on. Right, here we have a very interesting post called, "Am I the Asshole for Telling My Friend That She Does Not Remember 9/11? My friend, born 1998, was 3 years old when 9/11 happened. She's told the story a million times of being in class and having TVs wheeled in to show the kids what was happening on screen. She will bring up this story anytime 9/11 is mentioned. She is the oldest in our friend group, and the rest of us were not even alive when 9/11 happened. Recently, she retold this story, and when she said she was in class, someone asked her what classes they had for 3-year-olds. She tried to say she was in pre-K, but had previously told me she didn't even go to pre-K, and her mum put her straight in kindergarten at 5. I brought this up and she changed her answer and said it was actually daycare. Then that same person asked how she was able to vividly remember the events at just 3 years old, and she claimed she was so traumatized she was able to form a core memory. She continued her story by saying her mum was actually evacuated from where she worked in Texas because everyone was scared they would hit another high-rise building. But she had told me before that during her early childhood, her mum didn't work. She then tried to say her being evacuated from the building is the reason she quit. This basically turned into her defending her memory of 9/11 to a group of about 5 people who continued to poke holes in her story. At one point, when we were alone, I told her she probably at 3 years old did not understand what was going on or form any type of memory because her story had so many inconsistencies with other stories from her childhood, and that she probably only thinks she remembers 9/11 because of media depictions and what people told her happened on that day. She is a known dramatic. Basically, everyone knows she dramatizes her stories, but now she is mad at me because I don't believe her and told her the story is inconsistent. I didn't gang up on her with everyone else when she brought it up again. Privately is when I explained how I felt." So this is like kind of a fascinating story to me. There are a number of philosophical angles you could take on this. You could talk about whether it is appropriate sometimes to let untruths just kind of pass by in conversation in the interests of serving the kind of interpersonal peace if they're not that important. But the thing that I want to touch on is the fact that, as someone in the comments have pointed out, I don't think that her friend is necessarily lying here. And I have an example from my own childhood to illustrate this. So until I was about 11, 12-ish, I was convinced that as a very young child, I was involved in a train crash. This train crash just did not happen, but I had really vivid ideas and memories of this, that there was a fire. Like I can remember, like my family were there, my parents were there. I thought we were all involved in a train crash. And this wasn't like a lie. I earnestly believe this. And I think it's just because I was a very young child. And so I kind of confused either a dream or a particularly vivid imagining for the actual event. I just think that that's kind of something that we often do with memories at a young age. I'm very, very skeptical about the veracity of a lot of my earliest memories for that reason. But one of the other reasons why I think this is so interesting is that there is more generally, even outside of the domain of young children, a tendency for testimonial evidence to kind of get corrupted over time. And because it's in the past, until very recently, with the advent of like pictures and videos and things like that, it's been quite difficult to recognize that. So something you'll quite often hear is that every time you remember something, you edit it slightly in your mind. But this also happens between people, right? A good example of this, I reckon, is probably something like Herodotus. I may be getting this wrong because I haven't read Herodotus in almost a decade. But from what I remember, some of what Herodotus reports regarding, the events involving gods or deities or monsters is given to him by oral testimony where someone from a particular part of the world is describing kind of the oral tradition of their local community. So that would have been told to them by their parents and who have been told that by their grandparents and so on and so on and so forth, until you get to some kind of original person who supposedly witnessed this insane, miraculous event, often again involving gods or demons or monsters or what have you, things that like we know now probably don't exist, right? Even if you're a theist, you hardly tend to believe that the ancient Greek deities exist. Although there was a time, interestingly, sorry, there's a bit of a side tangent, but there is a period in kind of the medieval period and also the Renaissance where poets and other authors would kind of insert Greek deities into their depiction of the kind of Christian world, often as demons. But anyway, that's kind of a side tangent, not really relevant. My point is that this, to me, illustrates how, over a long period of time, originally the perception of what was probably an impressive but ultimately quite ordinary event can become transmuted into something that seems just like completely absurd. And while I think this is most obvious when it occurs between generations, because the telling and retelling of a story is going to, involve exaggeration, probably because one of the pressures of telling a story to an audience is that you want to make it more entertaining, right? That's you fulfilling your end of the social bargain. And one way to make something probably more entertaining is to exaggerate it. So the pressure's kind of on the side of exaggeration there. However, I do also think this can occur within like groups of friends and stuff like that. For example, I knew like this group of people from school who I haven't spoken to in a while or hadn't spoken to in a while until a couple of years ago, where they were telling me events from school that I remember in like incredibly exaggerated forms, to the point of them being like totally unbelievable. Like I remember the event as it happens, and I'm comparing their retelling of it, this being an event that has kind of been retold amongst that cycle of friends over and over again for years, right? Because, we meet up with old friends, we reminisce. And I kind of think that, to me at least, illustrated how even over a relatively short span of time, if there is a story that forms part of your kind of oral history of you and your group of friends, such that it is told and retold over and over and over again with slight exaggerations each time, actually, even in a relatively short few years, you can get quite a different picture of reality from what actually happened. And it often is exaggerated and heightened. So I don't know, this post interested me partly because got me thinking about that, because that in turn is relevant to discourse around things like miracles, right? So one of the kind of subtopics in philosophy of religion is the credibility or incredibility of various miracles. And often, right, miracles tend to have happened a while ago. Not always, sometimes you do get miracles that are seen as more recent. One that was very dominant on Substack recently was the miracle of Fatima, which happened in the early 20th century. But even in that case, right, you're relying on a lot of testimonial evidence. And that testimonial evidence tends to have been shared between groups of people and retold a number of different times. And, Fatima is a kind of its own particular example. People have looked at that quite in depth. But, let's say 300 years prior to that, you've got various miracle testimonies. And one of the key ideas about whether you can trust the testimony of these so-called miraculous events is whether the memory of the people there is reliable, or whether they can mistake ordinary naturalistic events for supernatural ones, not necessarily deliberately, and it's not necessarily that they're being dishonest. It's just that in the telling and retelling of a story over and over again amongst a group of people, there's this tendency towards exaggeration. So, I don't know, I think that's one example of where studying the sort of way that memories can change over time and the way that stories can change over time is quite important from a philosophical perspective. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think this person is particularly being unreasonable. They explained it in private, but I would hesitate to say that their friend is lying or being dishonest when she says that she remembers 9/11. It could well be that she believes that, even if it's not true. I think that is especially prevalent for early memories, and I think may well be prevalent for all sorts of memories. I just think that it's quite nerve-wracking to think about, so we don't often think about just how unreliable our memories likely are. That's kind of our first-hand guide to the past. It's terrifying to think that they might be totally unreliable. And yeah, sure, they're not totally unreliable, but just pondering the extent to which they might be unreliable is very scary. So I'm going to move swiftly on. Right, next up we have a post called "Am I the Arsehole for Telling My Friend That She's Becoming Insensitive?" And it reads as follows. For the past 10 years, I've known my best friend. I've seen her go from being a rough person to a sweet and kind girl. We've both grown a lot since adolescence, and we have a very strong bond. In recent months, she's gone through a lot of crappy experiences. Her university friend group broke up, and she lost contact with other people. I even considered ending the friendship last year because she became difficult to deal with and somewhat explosive. She's currently going to therapy and has improved a lot, but I noticed that if she was already someone chronically online without many real-life friends, she's become even more so. And honestly, I think that has significantly changed her attitude towards people. For example, she started sending me videos of people bothering others. Not harmless jokes, but unpleasant things that could have ended in tragedies, or people taking out their anger on children just because. When I told her I didn't find it funny, she stopped sending me those things. 2 days ago, she sent me a video of a girl who told how her friend group made plans without her, and that during one of the outings, a friend was shot. The girl survived. But the attitude with which she told the story was very mean girl-like, and she even seemed happy that her friend had been in mortal danger. Along with the video, she sent a message saying, "I'm the girl, honestly. Good the friend got shot." I immediately asked her if she didn't think that maybe spending so much time online had desensitized her a bit towards people. She told me no, and that she wasn't serious. When I asked why she would say something like that if she wasn't serious and that it wasn't even funny, she said, "I don't know, I think it's something normal to say." I told her it wasn't, and that it sounded like edgy teenage talk. And then there's a bit more that I'll skip, but it ends with this. Being honest, I'm aware that on social media people feel free to make those comments without thinking, but I think that's exactly why empathy is slowly disappearing, and I wouldn't want the sweet girl I became friends with to change and for it to affect her life. So, I think this is really interesting. I think that, many of you will find it interesting as well. I think that in today's day and age, so to speak, I think a lot of us have had people that were either acquaintances or friends kind of go through this process of being gradually desensitized towards saying and feeling quite kind of resentful and hatred-filled things because of their interactions online, and then taking that attitude into their day-to-day life in ways that can sometimes end unfortunately. I've certainly known people like that. I imagine many of you have known people like that as well. I think it's one of the real unfortunately corrosive parts of online discourse. The thing that I wanted to pick up on in this post specifically, however, is the fact that sensitivity is a virtue, right? We tend to, in the general zeitgeist, conceive of sensitivity as a moral good within certain limits. Someone can be too sensitive, but there's a certain kind of golden mean of sensitivity that we will praise, and somebody can be not sensitive enough, which, on the face of it, is a little bit odd, right? Because sensitivity is effectively asking somebody to feel less pleasant in certain situations. It's saying, when you encounter, sorry, I got hair in my mouth, when you encounter something sufficiently unpleasant or sufficiently hurtful, like you witness some harm being done, you ought to feel some of that harm. Which again, if you're a diehard utilitarian, that might seem incredibly odd. Why is it that I am obliged, or otherwise, it is a morally praiseworthy thing for me to feel bad when I'm witnessing suffering occur? Shouldn't if we're trying to minimize suffering, shouldn't it be that I should try and minimize the suffering that I feel, right? I mean, there are, if we look at, certain ancient schools of philosophy, a high premium is often placed on being able to peacefully experience suffering, both your own suffering and other people's suffering. Let's take Stoicism, for example. I want to be clear, right? Stoicism, or most forms of Hellenic Stoicism, and, also in the work of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus and Seneca, so also Imperial Stoicism, a broad emphasis is placed on helping others, right? Your duties towards others are a huge part of Stoicism, and I don't want to minimize that. However, Stoicism pointedly does not, necessitate feeling the sufferings of others. It just necessitates, acting to alleviate the sufferings of others and acting in accordance with your duties towards those who are suffering. So a Stoic might look at someone who is insensitive, but nonetheless continuing to fulfill their duties towards others quite positively, right? That is one step closer to becoming a sage. Doesn't alleviate them from those duties, but there's no need for them to suffer with the people that they're helping. And that's kind of something that we disagree broadly. I say, we in the incredibly wide sense of the word. I think if you were to stop most people on the street and describe them a person who does good things but does not feel compassionately with the people they're helping, and somebody who does good things and does feel compassionately with the people that they're helping, I'm open to be proven wrong about this, but I suspect that most people would view the person who feels, has compassion with the people they're helping as slightly more praiseworthy, which again, very, very interesting. On the face of it, that seems like an unproductive emotion. I suspect that there are a couple of ways you can go about justifying this kind of sensitivity as virtue thing. I've been working broadly on a video about manners and politeness because I think that they are incredibly underrated, especially online where we largely encounter strangers. I think we forget to what extent politeness is the lubricant that allows us to have smooth interactions with people that we have not met before. And actually, I think that online, where we don't have the social cues of somebody smiling or somebody having a generally friendly demeanor to us, manners become even more important because we kind of need an established code of being able to communicate to someone that we don't mean them any harm and we're just trying to have a polite interaction. I think that a lack of manners online does irreparable harm to our online discourse, and I think that is a real shame. But as I was going about researching for this video on manners, which I actually haven't worked on in a while, so I don't know when it'll be done, but it will be done. And I think it'll be very, very interesting. Anyway, when researching this video, I came across a paper by David Haid, and it's called Tact, Sense, Sensitivity, and Virtue. And it examines this question of why it is that tact, like social tact, the kind of indescribable or irreducible sensitivity that a tactful person has in social situations towards other people's embarrassment and feelings, why we consider that to be such a good thing, and exactly what that thing consists of. And one of the interesting etymological through lines that David Haid draws is that tact and tactfulness also is highly related to touch. Like that, somebody being tactile is somebody touching. If somebody's touches others when they talk to them, like gives them a hug, pats them on the shoulder, that kind of thing, we say that they're tactile. Tact is to do with like physical feeling. God, I don't know why I'm doing that, but you know what I mean. And this links quite closely with some of the praiseworthy consequences that often occur or spring from the actions of a highly tactful and positively sensitive person, which is that because they can kind of feel the feelings of people around them and kind of know them in a high level of fidelity, like a high level of detail, then they are able to adjust their behavior on the fly to accommodate a variety of different social situations and personalities and desires, and thus they are better at making people feel good around them. Like if you want a kind of brute consequentialist justification for tact, that would be it. And I think that this idea of specifically feeling the feelings of the people around them, and that being part of how a tactful person gathers information of how they should behave, allows us to make sense of why somebody being insensitive, even without any like major outward changes in their behavior, would strike us as a negative development. I think that it is at least partly because sensitivity is correlated and can give rise to these very finely tuned accommodating behaviors that help people feel more welcome or help people feel more understood. And yeah, I think that's one justification you can have for why sensitivity is important. I think it's why, in theory, you could have someone who is totally insensitive but is able to finely calibrate their behavior anyway. But I just think in practice that doesn't really happen. Like, I don't know if you know many insensitive people, but they sort of tend to, at least, find it quite difficult to take into account other people's feelings. That's kind of how you spot that they're insensitive. So I suppose, yeah, there's a kind of theoretical posit of somebody who is totally insensitive on the inside, a kind of, I don't know, compassion philosophical zombie, but nonetheless acts exactly like a totally sensitive person would on the outside. I just don't think that in practice that probably exists in our world, at least. So yeah, I think that's a good justification for why I think sensitivity is broadly seen as a moral virtue. And I think, it's why I think most people would say this person is not being unreasonable. It's because being insensitive is the kind of thing that we say it's reasonable to react negatively to that, because we consider insensitivity to be effectively a vice. But anyway, moving on. Okay, here we have quite an interesting post called, "Am I the asshole for saying I don't give an F about my roommate's baby? I'm 27 female, and I have a roommate 25 female. Originally, it was me and my roommate, but she got pregnant by her boyfriend, causing her boyfriend to move in. At first, it wasn't a big deal. He wasn't loud, and my roommate didn't really bother me. But as the months passed and she got more pregnant, she started becoming more entitled and rude. For an example, she would constantly steal my food, and when I tried to confront her, she would play the pregnancy cravings card. But the day that finally made me snap was the day I brought home a small, personal pumpkin pie. I wrote my name on the box and put it in the fridge. Later, when I went to get some, she was literally standing there eating my pie. Honestly, I wouldn't have cared if she only took a slice, but this bitch was literally eating the whole thing. And fed up with her always eating my food, I got mad and I yelled at her. I asked her why she was eating my pumpkin pie, knowing that it wasn't for her. She started crying and said she's pregnant and that she can't help that the baby was craving pumpkin pie. In a fit of rage, I yelled at her and said, I don't give one F about your dumb ass baby. She gasped dramatically, like I just said something world-shattering, and she ran off to tell her boyfriend what I said. Later, he called me a bitch for yelling at a pregnant woman who can't control her craving. So, am I the asshole for saying I don't give an F about my roommate's baby? So, obviously, the comments are largely on the poster's side, and I think that broadly makes sense. Like, most people would I think concur that this is it was reasonable for her to get angry about her pregnant roommate stealing her pumpkin pie. The thing that I find very interesting about this post, however, is that I think that there is the appeal there towards like pregnancy and the cravings of pregnancy as like something outside of the pregnant woman's control that alleviates her responsibility for her actions in some sense. And I think that's very interesting, because I think it ties into a type of moral discourse that I keep seeing appear in the public sphere, and it is normally tackling the question of what, in a, physicalist or relatively physicalist world, constitutes a state that would alleviate someone's responsibility for their actions. And this is like by no means a trivial problem, right? So one way that discourse around this often goes, it's normally to do with mental health stuff. Someone will say you've done a bad thing or you've done a morally condemnable thing, and then the person with a mental health issue or under the influence of kind of particular hormonal structures or whatever will say, it wasn't me, it was my brain, or it wasn't me, it was my body. And that, as a defense, kind of assumes a sort of dualism, right? It assumes that there is your physical form, your physical properties, including your brain and your bodily properties, and then somewhere floating above that is you, the agent you, who sits above all of this and has a separate moral story to the actions of your brain. And that isn't just a, non-physicalist story. It is fundamentally a kind of dualist story, right? Because, even if you're, say, a panpsychist, it still wouldn't make sense to draw a hardline separation between you and your brain stroke nervous system. Because panpsychism says that you are still that. It's just that is both physical and mental. Nonetheless, there do seem to be clear-cut cases where someone is in a particular mental state that seems to remove responsibility for their actions, at least to a certain extent, right? So a good example of this would be, say somebody is in the middle of a psychotic episode, right? And they, as a result, act completely out of character. They're violent and they're shouting at you and doing all sorts. Alternatively, let's say, to make it even more stark, let's say, someone has a brain tumor that causes them to be very violent. And then when that brain tumor is removed, they cease to be violent. These seem like circumstances wherein we tend to want to alleviate responsibility for this set of actions. At the very least, when this person is out of their temporary psychosis, or when this person has the brain tumor removed, it seems very strange to hold them accountable for their previous actions. So the question is, what framework makes sense of that, and yet also doesn't fall into some kind of dualism? And the way that I tend to see this, because I kind of take a pragmatist view on quite a lot of things, and so I tend to want to ask what a particular concept is doing, rather than necessarily always finding necessary and sufficient conditions for it, is I tend to think, okay, like what's the use of alleviating responsibility in the case of temporary psychosis and in the case of the brain tumor patient, right? And I tend to think it's because there is a sharp disjunct between the person undergoing temporary psychosis and the person not undergoing temporary psychosis, right? So it doesn't make sense to take behavior that the person performs or commits when they are in the temporarily psychotic state and use that to predict their behavior when they're outside of that state. And that, I think, is kind of the key factor. It's not necessarily that there's a kind of free will distinction between the in psychosis person and the out of psychosis person. It's rather that, in effect, we usefully split them into two separate people and say, okay, there's kind of John with psychosis and John without psychosis, and these are two distinct models that just so happen to occasionally be spatially co-located. That's kind of like a sort of appraiser relative, I suppose, model for how we might diminish responsibility when somebody is in these temporary special states, let's say, ameliorative states. Of course, the problem with that is that no longer works if somebody's state is chronic, right? So say the psychosis wasn't temporary, they just had a recalcitrant mental illness state that was causally linked to them performing in all sorts of antisocial ways, right? Under this model, it wouldn't make sense to not hold them responsible for those actions because they would be predictive of future behavior. And so, I don't know, people's intuitions, in my experience, it's anecdotal for what it's worth, it tends to be that people are quite split on whether it makes sense to hold that, to view that mental illness state as like separate from the person, or whether it's just that is one of the properties of the person, and as a result we can treat that as an agent for the purposes of responsibility ascriptions. Whereas other people, and my intuitions kind of lean towards this camp, but doesn't necessarily mean they're reliable, would be to say, I don't know, that it seems like there's something else that we want to necessarily be there in order to ascribe some kind of responsibility, be that responsiveness to reasons, or be that a kind of higher order endorsement, or what have you. There might be other ameliorative factors. But in public discourse, you do effectively see people take various different positions on what kind of states qualify someone for reduced responsibility for their actions. And that's essentially what this person is trading on when they try to defend eating the pumpkin pie with the argument that they are undergoing pregnancy cravings and those are strong compulsions that are outside of their control. I don't know. I think it's just I think that it is a very interesting and open philosophical question. And it's one of the more interesting styles of open philosophical question because it's something that not only is interesting within the context of academia, it's also something that very much impinges on people's everyday moral and agential ascriptions. I think it's fascinating. I'd be really interested to know what people think, because it is much harder than you might initially expect to draw an uncontroversial distinction between what actions someone ought to own and what actions they do not need to own under a physicalist framework, while respecting the idea that we are in some sense identical with our physiology. Because then, you can't draw this quite intuitive, but ultimately I think philosophically mistaken argument that it wasn't me, it was my brain. I don't know. It's one of those one of the many examples, I think, where our common sense idea of the way the mind works is caught between dualism and physicalism. And we kind of end up in this strange middle ground whereby we treat the mind as a sort of epiphenomena of the body. So we start, when someone says something like, it wasn't me, it was my brain, what they seem to be getting at is the idea that they're like not causally efficacious, or at the very least, their causal efficacy is secondary to the more primary causal efficacy of their brain, which is kind of committing these actions, and they're kind of off to the side somewhere, which, I don't know, that's a profoundly disempowering view of the person. It could be that it's correct. There are philosophers that take epiphenomenal views of the mind. I mean, arguably, under some interpretations of Nietzsche, he takes an epiphenomenal view of the conscious mind, even though, obviously the unconscious mind takes an awful lot of weight in Nietzsche's analysis. And ultimately, I think he ends up talking, when he ascribes actions and states to people, he seems to include their unconscious makeup within the kind of subheading of the person. So I don't know. It's an interesting debate. I'd be interested to know what you think, because I think it's a deeply non-trivial problem, and people tend to have quite strong intuitions either way. And I kind of don't know how well we arbitrate between those. And maybe it won't be solved until like the mind-body problem is put to rest. But I don't know. In the meantime, we do have to make these ascriptions. So it's very much a live problem, and do let me know what you think. Right, that's all we have time for today. If you want to see the last installment of this Am I the Arsehole based video, you can watch it right here. Thank you so much for watching this one, and have a wonderful day.